So for those of you who have not yet looked at the solicitations, you can find them all at idahoSpaceGrant.org, and hopefully you found your way to look at those solicitation documents. They are all due. There are 3 different grants available right now, and those are the research seed grants, undergraduate research and STEM engagement grants, and then pre-college grants. And you can look at those for how much is available for each of them. As a note, all of our grants require a 1-to-1 cost share. And we'll get into cost share later. It doesn't mean that if you're asking for $10,000 that you have to come up with $10,000 cash. Stay tuned, because we'll run over all of that. Allison will give you lots of great tips on that later on. So don't let that be intimidating to you. All 3 solicitations all have the same due date, which is December 1st, coming up here. And the other thing to keep in mind is that all of those projects have got to be done by February 20th, 2019. If you think there's a chance that you can't finish by that time, you should seriously think about it or reconsider, because that's not our choice. It's when our funding ends. And so we have to end things right around that time. And so aside from the 1-to-1 cost share, which all of our money has to have, some of the other requirements include that if you are receiving money or contributing cost share, you have to be a United States citizen. And when we say that, it's actual citizens, not permanent residents. Now, for those of you who are not U.S. citizens, but you are permanent residents, or you work at, say, a university here in Idaho, there will be other grants coming out from sort of our sister organization here, the Idaho NASA EPSCoR program, and we help run that program as well. And in a couple of weeks, we will release a solicitation for research seed grants or initiation grants, which are very similar, that permanent residents or employees of, accredited higher education institutions can apply for. So we will send out information about that. There is a new Idaho NASA EPSCoR website that will be available that we will release those on, but that's in the final stages of development right now. So just to keep that in mind. The other requirements are that, if you, because all of our grants require 1-to-1 cost share, it's very important that before you submit that, you make sure that you have put that through either your grants office or your research office, either at your university or your institution, or somebody who has fiscal responsibility to understand that they are committing resources to this grant. That's very important, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But essentially, especially if it's cost share in terms of in-kind time or whatnot, it's best that you don't go rogue and commit things on behalf of your university or institution without having prior approval on that. All right, I think we'll go to the next slide. So, Allison, were you taking the first part of this?
This slide is about what criteria the proposals will be evaluated on, of course. Each of the solicitations outlines specifically how that type of proposal will be evaluated, and there are some differences, so be sure to look carefully at the solicitation that you're applying under. But these 6 here, I think, are the major themes, the big ones that you want to be paying attention to. So when we talk about merit, we're talking about you making sure that you communicate why it's important so that a layperson could understand it. Our reviewers come from diverse backgrounds, and we typically have fairly small review teams, so we can't, since they're volunteer reviewers, we can't necessarily guarantee that someone from your field will be present on our review panel. So that makes it really important to make sure that anyone who is scientifically literate or generally familiar with science and STEM in general could understand. Also, as you're writing, think about what context you have that the reviewers might not have. I think that this tends to come up more in our K-12 proposals, where if you're immersed in your K-12 world and you know what maybe acronyms stand for or what regions, what the region names are or things like that, the reviewers don't necessarily have that context, so make it explicit. We really want to see better representation of diverse students on the grants that we're funding. What that looks like for your project in particular obviously will be very different from other projects, but it's definitely something that you should be addressing in your proposal. And diverse groups, underrepresented groups, can mean everything from what we typically think of, like minority students or STEM. In our case in Idaho, it also refers to first-generation students, rural students, and low-income students. The next major thing, perhaps the most important thing that you spend some time carefully thinking about, is your budget. Make sure that your spreadsheet that you provide us with and your narrative align. If they say two different things, that's going to be very confusing for reviewers. So a good approach to that might be to ask someone who hasn't been working on it intensively for the past month to take a look at it and make sure that it makes sense to them. Also, it is really important that you avoid requesting or cost sharing non-allowable things, because if you're selected, you'll have to edit them out anyway. If you have questions about what's allowable, we would be happy to answer those questions. But the short answer is we are a federal source of funding, so you have to follow federal grant requirements. Susie, do you want to take it?
Sure. Absolutely. And just another note on that, we tried to make it as clear as possible in just following up to the budget, some of the big things that are not allowable. So be sure to read the solicitations carefully to make sure that you're not putting in like some big deal breakers are like food and deciding to buy team t-shirts or things like that. Those are things that generally, and it's in the solicitation, but if you have something you think is important for what you're trying to get and you for your proposal, and you have questions about whether or not that is allowable, you can always ask your research office or give us a call and we'll try to talk about that. So in terms of alignment with Idaho Space Grant or NASA, what we are trying to do is to make sure that the things and activities that we fund here are in alignment with NASA's aims and goals and interests for any number of reasons, but just so we're all on the same page and we're working towards the same goal. And the reason that is important because it helps us to stay relevant, as well as it helps NASA accomplish its mission by tapping resources that it doesn't normally tap through our organization. So a lot of good ways to find that alignment is through NASA's own documents. So let's say that you are interested in a proposal for like satellite propulsion or something like that. Go and find on NASA's website, and it could take some searching, but their technology roadmaps or their plans, or if it's things like Earth Science, their decadal survey or space science, that sort of thing, and be specific about the reason why NASA would be interested in this is because it's here in their roadmap. They're looking for these innovative technologies related to X, Y, and Z. Be specific about that. We are, if NASA is doing it, then we are interested in it. And I can tell you now that NASA does many things from earth science and forestry to biology to to rocket propulsion to even accounting systems and computing systems. There's tons of things. And if you can find where NASA has identified a need for it, then that certainly applies for us. So, but also when you're trying to communicate that alignment, going back to the fact that our review panel is diverse, that you need to communicate that alignment and the benefit. You don't want to go into something saying, well, you know, we're developing an alternative to hydrazine because NASA needs it. For some people, they might not know that what hydrazine is used for, you know, that it's used as a propellant, you know, and that by developing an alternative, you would want to go further to say, because this alternative will help have a cheaper propellant or a greener propellant or whatever, like connect the dots for the researcher, for the reviewers of it. As far as timeline and metrics and deliverables, again, being specific is helpful. And we'll go into that a little bit more on a later slide about those sorts of things. And then in terms of future funding and technology transfer potential, you know, really think outside the box. What NASA doesn't want to do, and what happens too often, is that sometimes researchers will come up with a great innovation, do it, and then just sort of put it on a shelf and not think about it again, because that was sort of, you know, that task was done. So NASA really wants to share that data. They want to share those innovations, and then whenever possible, you know, what can we build off of that? And that could be that a lot of people use the research seed grants as a way to just sort of do sort of a test bed, a small scale test bed demonstration of whatever it is that they're doing, whether it's, you know, a new algorithm or a new component or whatever that is, or new approach in forestry, whatever that is, so that they can then apply for something else. And some of the places that you can look for future funding is looking at NASA's solicitations. And it doesn't have to be something that's going to come out, you know, in 3 months or in 6 months. It helps if that, you know, that if you know, okay, every year NASA has they have different annual solicitations, like ROSES is a lot for their science solicitations. And there's another one called Tech Ready or whatnot, which focuses on technology development. You know, look through that NASA Inspires. Here in the presentation, you can click on those links to some of the places that you can search and see what they did in the past, what sort of things they were looking for, because they sometimes will specify, you know, right now we're looking for, you know, lunar landing capabilities, or, you know, communication technologies. So look there and see, so that you can be specific when you're talking about future funding and saying, you know, if this project is successfully completed, we plan to apply for the NASA ROSES astrophysics, you know, grant in 2019 or whatnot, so that they know that you are actively planning that this is a stepping stone. And if you don't want to do that, you can, some other places that are sort of out of the box are looking at like NASA Small Business Innovative Research, SBIR, to see what if you are thinking about having an industry partner, to see what sort of things. NASA will sometimes just specify, we are looking for X or Y, and hopefully they will find small industry partners that will be, that they'll look through and award through that. And thinking further out of the box, you can look at some of NASA's challenges and try to frame a project around that. Like there's an ice drilling challenge, there's like a 3D printed habitat challenge. There's other things like that that you can try to build a project around, or like student launch, if you were thinking of a rocketry thing, that you could do things like that this project would help you prepare to apply to some of those NASA challenges. Of course, challenge.gov, Innocentive, those are also more challenge-based areas of future funding. And it's just and that is government agencies as well as large commercial firms looking for innovative solutions to things. So you can get an idea there if you're looking for ideas of what might be good. And of course, if you don't necessarily have to always say, we're going to apply for the next NASA grant, because maybe, you know, if you're looking for something sizable, then your next thing is to go to the National Science Foundation or to the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency or whatnot, DARPA. And so all of those links are places where you can check out for other future funding and you know, whether or not what you develop is something that can be developed commercially and spun off into a business or whatnot. And if it's not, that's fine. But we just want people to think about what are the next steps after this grant, because it's the goal of things like all of these things, all of our solicitations, is to get you started so that you can then go and find other sources of funding or generate your own with your great ideas and activities. Sorry about that. Taking so long. We can go on to the next one.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about diversity plans. When you're writing your diversity plan, there are definitely some better ways to do it and some ways that could be improved. Try not to be general and try to focus on specific actions that you will take. Identifying specific organizations or people who you'll be working with is a great idea. So, for example, saying that you will be working with your minority office on your campus to ensure that the opportunity is seen by those minority students would be helpful. And all the better if you can name a contact that you already have a relationship with in that office. The other thing that we want to specifically point out is that we've heard from some faculty that female students in particular benefit a lot from specifically being reached out to and asked to join projects. So if you're looking for ways to get more female students involved, especially on your research projects, then we strongly suggest that you think about which female students you know who would be a good fit for your project, and then specifically ask them to join you. Or if you've already asked them to join your project, say that you did that in your proposal. Say that as part of your diversity plan, you've already reached out to these female students. I'll let you read through the rest of the examples on kind of the better side and the not so great side on your own. And if you have any follow-up questions about that, we can certainly answer those questions in a bit.
All right, so next we'll talk a little bit about project timelines. The reason why this is important, obviously, as we mentioned before, projects can't go past February 20th of 2019. So it's important to have that realistic timeline. And, you know, not just, you know, top level tasks, is to really think through it. And to think about what tasks are dependent on others and which ones are likely to throw a wrench in your project. If there's sort of a long pole, you know, making sure you've identified that and you've built in some contingency time for that. It's always great. One of the things that it displays to reviewers, if you have a really solid and good timeline, is that you've really thought this through. You've figured out, you haven't just sort of phoned it in. And so when possible, one way to do that, or that you should think about, you don't necessarily have to show it to the reviewers, is like planning those expenditures. You know, are you going to purchase all of your supplies in the first quarter, or is that, you know, saved to the end? I can tell you right now that it is much better for you to plan to be spending on a regular basis or towards the front end, because when you start, if you find that you have a lot of money left over at the end and you start buying things that were not planned for or taking trips that were not planned for, those are huge audit risks and are likely to be ineligible for actually being paid on the grant, because it just looks like you're trying to spend the money, and spending the money because we have it left is not a strong enough justification. You know, you should spend the money in support of your project and the objectives that you outline. So think about that as you are planning your project. And as you're planning that and the tasks, identifying those milestones that truly indicate the progress of your project, not just things like this is when we'll turn on our report and this is when we'll do, that we'll have a meeting or this or that. It's things that it'll be clear so that if I were to look at your timeline and call you up and say, hey, so have you done this part already? That I know sort of where you are in your project. And think about your, the backup plans, just in the event that things don't go as you thought. Of course, I always suggest, there are some people who make timelines and then they never use them again. They don't look at them. I suggest that however much you can, to use that as an active planning tool and as a communication tool with your team. And do that really detailed version, which then you can roll up to be put into the proposal. And I have found that the process of project planning and timeline planning is an excellent way to get students involved in the proposal planning process. For those of you who are planning things, whether a research seed grant with a graduate student or an undergraduate research grant with students or other like pre-service teachers or anything else like that, to get them to think about how do you plan a project from start to finish. And some people do their timelines in Word or in Excel, but if you really want to use it as an active project planning and execution tool, then you can use other things like Microsoft Project or Smartsheet or Trello, or there's a link to a review of different project planning softwares that are available, something for you to check out, as long as you use what you and your team are comfortable using. I know one of our undergraduate research teams uses something called Slack, just something to keep the project moving and people communicating. So don't just see it, I guess the overall message here is don't just see the timeline as something that you just need to do to submit the proposal. It is our hope that you use it as a tool for executing as well. All right. And then the next bit is on collaborators. So it's a little bit different for each of our grant types. For research seed grants, absolutely having a NASA or aerospace industry collaborator really gives you a leg up on getting selected. Now, there have been proposals here and there that have been funded without them, but because the benefit was so great to Idaho, or the case was so compelling that that it was funded, but that's usually few and far between. So if you don't have a NASA collaborator, there's a couple of things that you can, or aerospace industry collaborator, there's some things you can do. Check your network first. Quite often there are people at your university that are already working with NASA researchers, and it may not be in your area, but the more that, like if you have somebody that has lots of connections to Ames Research Center or whatever, then you never know if they might know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. So leverage those connections, and at the same time, check out, if you don't know that there are 10 NASA centers, well, there's 10 NASA centers and other minor facilities as well. Learn about those centers and learn, they all have slightly different specialties. So if you are looking at things for, missions to Mars and, things like that, you're going to go to, a lot of times, to JPL if you're doing planetary science, spacecraft and things like that. But if you're really interested in Earth science, you're maybe going to go look at Goddard Space Flight Center. If you're looking at astrobiology, you might be at Ames. But they all do, some of them do little bits of everything. If you're thinking of human spaceflight things, you're going to look at Johnson Space Center. And if you're looking for, like propulsion systems, you're going to be at Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, or sometimes new propulsions at Glenn Research Center. So do a little homework on the centers that your type of research might be being done at. And then you can look and see if there are other people at your institution that are doing research at those centers. And then so you can search a couple of different places, but that link for the NASA NSSC, there's a form there that you can just like fill out, for instance, like University of Idaho, and for the awardee. And it'll generate a huge list of all of the grants from NASA that have been issued to the University of Idaho. And you could be like, hey, I know that person, or whatnot. So it's just something to consider. You can also look at upcoming solicitations or even past solicitations on Inspires or SBIR, because quite often there will be program executives listed. So you could call them and say, hey, I am looking for a NASA collaborator in this area. Can you give me any recommendations? Sometimes that doesn't always work, but you never know. And then most of the NASA centers have a University Affairs office or whatnot. And we've provided a couple links to Johnson Space Centers and JPLs. And so those are a couple places to try first. And then, of course, Googling like NASA and, like deep space communication protocols or something like that. You'd be amazed at the web pages that you will find and the people who are working on them, articles, and of course, publications and papers are always great. And then if you're hitting a dead end, please give us a call. We can't always promise that we can get you in there, but we have contacts at many of the NASA centers, and I will work hard, Allison and I will both work hard to try to get you connected as long as you give us enough time. It can't be the week before, so, by November 10th or so, and we'll see what we can do, depending on just how many requests come in for that. If it's thousands, we might not be able to get to all of them. As for undergraduate research and engagement grants, having like a one-on-one collaborator is not 100% necessary, but if you're participating in like a NASA program, that's a great strong tie to NASA, because we know there's going to be good content there. We know that you will have interactions with NASA centers. So I put some links in there for some of the more popular programs like Microgravity University, the NASA Develop program, and actually there is a Develop node down at Idaho State University. If you're not aware of that program, it's a great one. The Centennial Challenges and NASA Solve, those are another place where you can look for things to do, because it doesn't have to be, oh, we're going to go and participate in this program. It could be, we saw this cool challenge on NASA Solve, and we're just going to get a group of students together that are going to work on that for this year, and we need funding to work on that solution so that we can try to submit that to NASA, to one of those challenges. So that's another thing you can do. And as for pre-college projects, we know that can be very difficult for finding a NASA collaborator. It's not impossible, but NASA education, especially right now, is in a bit of a state of flux. So you can consider collaborating with other people in Idaho. And those are some examples of some of our affiliates, and you can look on our webpage for many more of our affiliates. And so that's one option. The other option you can do is just using NASA resources, because NASA has a ton of resources on its webpage, and that's not the only one that they have, but that link to NASA resources for education has learning, lesson plans, and all sorts of other resources that can be used. And if you have a great idea that, you want to have some sort of Mars module for, a quarter or something like that, and using all those, but you need money for printing and then taking them to some other thing, you can do lots of things with some of those resources. Or to get students, much like in the undergraduate research grants, to get students involved in one of NASA's citizen science challenges, like identifying craters on Mars or whatnot. There's lots of great programs to participate in. And one last thing, regardless of what type of grant, if you are having a collaborator, that reviewers really do read those collaboration letters, and they pay attention to whether or not that collaborator is really engaged in that. And you can just tell by the letters, just like if any of you have read recommendation letters for students, and you can tell when a teacher or an educator or a professor or an employer really knows that student and is really recommending them, or if it's kind of lukewarm and they're just trying to say nice things and that sort of thing. Making sure that that collaborator is being specific about why they're interested in the outcome of that project or how they're going to help is important. Just we have had instances where people give us not very strong letters, and that sort of torpedoes the whole thing. So and that's especially for research seed grants. So it's just something to keep in mind. I think this is you, Allison.
Oh, yep. All right. So let's talk about budgets, friends. If you are from Boise State, use the template that Boise State's research office has you use, because their template is great. If you're not from Boise State and you're not so lucky as to have that wonderful template available to you, then let's right now go over the things that we like you to have in your budget, or what I call budget anatomy. Okay. So first of all, up here at the top, it's really important that you put information so that we can easily link your budget with your proposal. A lot of times this gets left off and it makes it confusing for us. These things that I have circled here are the budget categories. For those of you who can't see them, it's salary, fringe, and sometimes those are combined together into personnel. Then there's materials and supplies, travel, and what's called different things at different organizations. Sometimes it's called overhead, sometimes it's called F&A, and sometimes it's called indirect. These are the only categories of expenses that you should have. Lots and lots of things get lumped into materials and supplies, for example. Right. Okay, then under each of the budget categories, you'll have specific expenses. Any budget category, like for example, materials and supplies, that has money allocated to it needs to have sub-items in it. It needs to have the money allocated to something in particular. So what I mean by that is you can't just say that you want $10,000 worth of materials and supplies. We need to know which materials and supplies. And then, so if you're looking at this slide now, or if you look at it later, you'll see that on each of these item lines, we've listed out some specific information that we need. You don't need to necessarily include that information in your budget spreadsheet, but if it's not in your budget spreadsheet, it definitely needs to be in your budget justification. So for example, in your travel section, it's not ideal for you to just say that you need travel for 4 people to Johnson Space Center. It would be better to say 4 people's airfare at $400 per person, and then list out $1,600. All right. Then talking specifically about the overhead, or whatever your institution calls it, the way that you'll do this section is to sum up your total direct costs, which is everything that you listed in your budget up until that point. Then you'll talk about, you'll have a line for modified total direct costs, or that's often abbreviated to MTDC. That's just the direct costs that are subject to overhead. Different institutions have different rules for what is subjected to overhead, and sometimes the rules change a little bit depending on circumstances. So if you're not sure what the rules are, definitely ask your grants office or your research office or whoever would have a good answer for that. Then you calculate your indirect costs, which earlier I referred to as overhead because it has 3 different names, which is fun. You calculate your indirect costs by multiplying your institution's indirect rate times the direct costs that are subject to the indirect. So, for example, Susie, what is the University of Idaho rate? I can never remember what the rates are off the top of my head.
Well, if you are a University of Idaho proposer to this, you will need to use 45.3%. That is not the current indirect rate. The current indirect rate actually at UI is 47.5%, but because this is an older grant, it gets a grandfathered indirect rate. So UI proposers should use 45.3.
Thank you. So if you are at a university or some colleges, you'll have an indirect rate for your institution. So you'll need to check what that is if you don't know already. If your institution doesn't have a federally negotiated rate for that indirect, then you can use 10%. That's the federally accepted default rate. All right, so you would multiply your modified total direct cost by that rate, and that is your total indirect costs. And then, of course, the total costs for the entire project are your indirect costs plus your direct costs. Okay, so those were the rows that we were talking about just there. Now we're going to move on to columns. You should have one column for your ISGC request. Any funds that you are requesting from ISGC should be in that column. Then, as Susie mentioned earlier, all of our grants require one-to-one cost share. We'll talk more about where you get your cost share from in a minute. But you might have cost share coming from multiple sources, or it might not necessarily be clear to reviewers where the cost share is coming from unless you explicitly say where it's coming from. So what I recommend is that for each source of cost share that you have, create a new column and label it based on what that source of cost share is. So if some of your cost share is coming from faculty salary, faculty who are at Boise State, for example, then you would have a column labeled Boise State match. But some projects, especially K-12 projects, have cost share coming from multiple sources. So you might not just have one column for Boise State match. You might have, in addition to that column, a column for volunteer hours match. And then you might have another column for Discovery Center of Idaho match, for example. So you could have as many columns as you needed to make it clear where that match is coming from. All right, so that's budget anatomy for you. Did you have anything else that you wanted to say on that, Susie?
You know, the only thing I would say is that if you are partnering with, let's say that you are a K through 12 or pre-college grantee, and you're partnering with somebody like Boise State or, you know, College of Western Idaho or whoever, we would advise that you try to run it through that university's research office, because it just makes things easier on you and on them. Because usually the universities are well set up to talk to each other and to understand how they're budgeting things. If that's not possible, that's okay. But if you are in that situation, it's usually easier to have them sort of be the lead, and then the other entity, like a K-12 school or informal ed center, would be sort of a subcontractor to them, and you would reflect that. That's one other category that could show up, is subcontracts. If for some reason you decided to partner with an industry partner, you could have that. If you're not sure where something should go in the budget, and you don't have a research office to ask for whatnot, or you're having trouble with them, you can always give us a call and we'll let you know, because there can be small variations. But thank you, Allison. That's great.
And sometimes, even if your university does have a research office, they're not always super well equipped to deal with more complicated budgets like that, where there are perhaps multiple subcontracts or things like that. So your university office might refer you to us anyway. Okay, so now we can talk about cost share. We divide cost share up into these two broad categories of personnel cost share and then other cost share. So we'll talk about personnel cost share first. The first way that's often easiest, especially on research projects, is to count faculty or staff time that's being devoted to the project as cost share. So as with all of our cost share, it has to come from a non-federal source, but many faculty do have time that's paid from non-federal funds. So you can use that time, and I'll run through an example of how that would look in just a second in case you're not familiar with it. The second possibility is if you have students who are working for your project and they're being paid from another source, that can be cost share. Again, it has to be from a non-federal source. So an example of that would be if, I think sometimes I've heard about departments having programs where the department will kick in some funding for students to work on a grant, on a project. The third way, and the way that is by far easiest to get cost share for K-12 projects, is through volunteer time. Volunteer time cost share is calculated at the state approved rate of $21.10 per hour. So you can imagine that this would really quickly add up for a volunteer who's putting in even 5 hours. So examples of volunteers would be a teacher who is mentoring a student team on the weekends. You can't count as volunteer time, teacher time that's during the normal workday, but teacher time that happens outside of their normal workday is definitely fair game for volunteer time. Parent chaperones are absolutely volunteers, so definitely count that. A student setting up or tearing down from an event or staffing an event is definitely cost shareable as volunteer time. The only thing that we would prefer is that only people over 18 are documented as volunteers. If you anticipate having volunteers that are not 18 yet, we can discuss that, but the rules for what counts as volunteering get a little bit tricky when we're talking about minors. Then the fourth and final type of personnel cost share is paid or volunteer time that's spent mentoring or consulting for the project. So this is kind of like the ones that we've talked about before, but essentially our point here is when you're thinking about your time or someone else's time that they're spending on a project, don't necessarily think just about the time when you're in the lab doing the science or engineering of the project. Think about the time when you're going to be working with students who are working on the project, or think about the time of your industry partner who will be consulting you or reviewing things for you, that kind of thing. That is fair game for cost share as well. On the other cost share side of things, basically any project expense that's paid for or donated by another non-federal source is fair game. So if you have grants or sponsorships from businesses or the state of Idaho or nonprofits, things that you pay for with those grants or sponsorships, assuming that the costs are allowable, do count as cost share. Something that comes up sometimes is some travel expenses might be paid out of pocket by you or by your students or by parents who are bringing their students to an event. If those would be allowable for reimbursement, but the person doesn't request reimbursement for them, then those can count as cost share. So one example that I can think of off the top of my head that would be likely to come up is if you have parents who are going to be driving their students, say, an hour to an event in Boise, and you don't think that it is a good use of the parents' time or your time to do reimbursements for all of those individual people, you can still claim it as cost share by documenting how far they traveled, multiplying it by the state mileage rate, and using that amount as cost share. Also, back on the personnel side, the parents' time driving their students could also be considered volunteer time and cost shared that way. And then the final way to get other cost share is through waived costs. So for example, if there's a fee associated with using a specific piece of equipment or a facility, and the organization that would normally take payment for that is waiving the cost for you, you can count that as cost share. Your institution might waive the overhead or indirect or F&A, whatever they call it, and that waived overhead can also be considered cost share. The only thing to keep in mind for both of those two types of waived costs is that there has to be an established documented rate in order for you to claim it as cost share. So that's just something to be a little bit cognizant of. Okay, and then one last topic that I want to cover related to budgeting is how to deal with budgeting when you've got pending funding sources. So this would come up if you have another grant out and you're expecting both our grant and that other grant to cover the expenses of your project. So I have come up with what I consider to be a good order of operations for dealing with this scenario. And I also have examples listed out for each of the steps. I'm not going to go over the examples because we're running a little short on time and I want to make sure that we have time to answer questions. But the order of operations would be to first fill in any cost share in your budget that you already know that you have. Second, determine the maximum request that you would make of ISGC and then fill in the request column. Third, add any additional expenses that have not made it into the spreadsheet yet into the cost share columns. Fourth, if the request is still exceeding the cost share, then you'll need to migrate some of the request items over into the cost share columns, being sure to tell us which cost share source you would use to cover them. And then there's no need to include expenses that you intend to pay from other sources unless they're needed for cost share. So to put that another way, if there's pending funding that you have that hasn't been accounted for in your budget, that's okay as long as your cost share is greater than or equal to the request. If you're dealing with a scenario like this and you're having trouble figuring out how to approach your budget, email me and I would be more than happy to help you work through it because it really is a bit of a tricky situation. And we definitely also understand that sometimes other funding sources don't come through, and if that does end up being the case, we can work with you to figure out what adjustments we could make to the budget that you submitted to accommodate that other funding source not coming through. All right, so with that, we'll move on to questions. If you're able to unmute yourself, go ahead and do that and ask away.
If anybody's talking, we can't hear you. We think you're still muted.
Okay, then I'll start. May I? My name is Hassan. I'm from Computer Science Department.
Hi.
Hi. The kinds of research I am interested in, I think, is mostly goes without saying in software. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in some application in environmental science or climate change,
Okay.
carbon sequestration, those kind of things. And partly probably something to do with NASA image data. Okay. I have been talking to on campus with Luigi Buschetti, who is a NASA researcher, I think. And also off campus, I was talking to Steve Running in University of Montana.
Okay.
So I have some ideas, but I don't know who the NASA partner would be. Other problem is I'm not a US citizen. So I think I'll have to wait for the EPSCoR call and see what I can do. I talked to Joe Law, and he suggested that I talk to you.
Wonderful. I agree that the EPSCoR is probably your best bet. And the EPSCoR solicitation will be very similar to the research seed grant so that gives you sort of an advanced look at the sort of things we're looking at. And now would be the time to start looking for that collaborator. And so you're certainly welcome to set up a meeting with me. It's easier. You're here on campus. And for those of you who are not on campus, we can do a telecom, a one-on-one Zoom like this or whatnot. But I've got a couple of ideas depending on the specific thing that you're looking at. We have some great connections in terms of like earth science with the earth science applications division or whatnot at NASA headquarters, because we've got some fantastic people down at Idaho State University who've been working with them doing some fire-related research. But it's one of these things where you get to one person and they know somebody who gets you to someone else, and that's why it takes a little bit of time sometimes, because we won't know exactly the right person, but someone will get us to someone who'll get us to someone. So we anticipate. We don't yet have the exact amount that those research initiation grants will be. Traditionally they were $27,500, but I think we are trying to see if we can massage our budget so that we can have those be larger than that and more akin to what's going on in the research seed grants on the Idaho Space Grant side. So that's why they're not released yet, because we're in a budget exercise right now. But I would anticipate that we will release those within the next month. So
that brings me to the related question. I think I looked at the past EPSCoR calls, and I noticed that it's in the vicinity of 25,000. So as you know, that our times are very limited in terms of teaching, research, and all this stuff. So we have to pick and choose how much effort we put into this kind of a grant for 25,000 and ultimately. So the question is, how likely it is to succeed in an EPSCoR grant for a $25,000 project, which will get me started on an idea that can lead to a bigger project, right? So that means it will not be very well formed, it will not be very well developed, it will not also be very well focused or articulated even, right? Because I'm trying to start. So how likely are those projects to be funded? Because my experience with some of the other smaller seed grants on campus is not very good.
Yeah.
So I will be very careful in spending my time.
Of course. Now, part of whether or not it'll get funded really depends on the number of proposals that we receive, obviously. There have been cases in the past where, we only receive 5 proposals and we can fund 3, which is pretty good, pretty good odds. But in the last year or so, we are averaging about 10 to 12 proposals that we receive. And then typically we can fund either on the space grant side or on the EPSCoR side, depending on if they're all asking for the maximum, usually we can fund 2, sometimes 3. And so it's not bad odds. It's not like some NASA solicitations that'll have hundreds of proposals. So, and I don't know about the other proposals or seed grants on campus. It depends on their process. I think the other thing that increases your chances of being funded, and that's what we're trying to really get across this year, is to understand that given the broad nature of our solicitations, especially in terms of research seed grants, and this applies both for Space Grant and for EPSCoR, is that we get them in all disciplines. So it is not likely that we will have a subject matter expert in your particular area reviewing the proposal. So then,
and that's what I felt in the other seed grants, that they are not getting what I'm saying, and I'm not being able to articulate well enough for people are not my well-known or know about the subject too much.
Absolutely.
So the comments they make, it shows that.
Yes. And so what we are trying to get across to people this year in particular is to encourage them to seek out, peer review outside of their circle, who know what they're talking about, and say, do you get what I'm trying to do, and why NASA or Idaho or the public would be really interested on how this it makes things better. If for some reason, because you could talk about, okay, well, I want to help develop this algorithm that'll help dig through data faster, and it'll return so many terabytes in 10 seconds, whatever. That's a little, but it'll talk like that, as opposed to making the connection one step further to say, this algorithm has the potential, if fully developed, to enable faster weather forecasts, which can translate to, more advanced warning for tornadoes or this or that, take it that one step further. And I'm not saying, overstate it and say like, oh, this will solve all of the world's problems, but to the point where somebody, when that reviewer gets done reading it, they can sum up to somebody they meet in the elevator. I just read this great proposal that is going to improve our data mining capability tenfold, and make us be able to do stuff. Getting to that is sort of what I have seen over the last couple of years is the common theme, is that if somebody can really get that across and that benefit, and with that, while having that, it's that hard, delicate balance between talking enough about the science to make it look like you know what you're talking about, and then being able to drive it home. But that's the problem usually with
I agree.
Everything. But hopefully, you have peers that can assist with that, or to leverage some of the other assets on campus to say, do you know what I'm talking about here?
Okay, I'll set up an appointment with you and talk to you in person.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm audible. I don't. Yes. Hi, my name is Mohammed Ifeda. Thank you, guys. Really, Allison and Susie, for it's very informative. I sort of share with Jamil part here or Hassan. A part is I just started about 8 weeks now, 9 weeks. I understand that the quality or detail level of the, I guess, collaborator / person from NASA sort of giving a strong recommendation is probably an important thing. I don't know how you see that happening with us being new or trying to get hooked up with people that really don't know us.
Well, so we can try to help facilitate some of those introductions. If you do some of those first steps that we mentioned, do a little checking around, see sort of what center might be interested in your work. And if you're really sort of, I understand, like for me, NASA's easier to navigate because I've spent my whole career working with NASA. So it's a little bit easier. If you're having trouble saying, I'm kind of looking for this, I can at least give you some tips on where to go and do some more searching. So that's one thing. The other thing is sometimes to take the long view on this, in that if you can afford to wait a little while, and knowing that we'll release these kind of solicitations, heaven willing, that our program continues as is not cut or something next year, that we will we do these on an annual basis. So if you know that this year that maybe you want to plan for this next year as well, then a couple of things that you can do besides looking for a collaborator right now, or looking to find somebody in your network that's already working with NASA and see if you can collaborate with them on their current project to sort of get your foot in the door. That's one way. The other way that's sort of a backdoor is that I've been really encouraging people is to use your students as a bridge. So if you have graduate students or undergraduate students you've been working with that you think are outstanding and that you think would be good in a NASA internship, there is something called the Aussie system. You can just look at intern.nasa.gov and you can look through the internship opportunities that are available coming up this next spring and next summer. And you can search, say that your specialty is electrical engineering. You can look at what sorts of electrical engineering projects they have that they're looking for interns for. And then if you've got a great student, encourage that student to go and work, apply, and hopefully if they get into that internship. And again, we help place interns. So talk to me or talk to Allison and we will learn more about you and your student and the opportunities they're applying for. We can't always promise that they'll get placed exactly into that opportunity, but if we know about it, then we can call that center and say, hey, I've got this great student who can go and work on this project and we have funding for them, so NASA gets that intern for free. And then you can plan to go out and visit the student during their internship and start a collaboration that way. And like I said, it takes a lot more effort and it's a bit more of a backdoor, but we've had a number of folks get larger and larger grants using their students as bridges like that.
All right.
Just as a thought.
We also recently had a conference like this with a NASA internship coordinator at NASA Ames, and I have the recording from that meeting and some notes that they gave to us if your student is interested in learning more about the process of applying to a NASA internship. So you can just have them email us and I will send that link your way. Or their way.
Now, did that answer your question or was it just sort of skirting all around it?
Oh, no, it answered it. I mean, it gave you a couple of tips, but maybe I can ask you, have you seen faculty as early as 1 semester old get seed grants?
Yes. And, but sometimes they will apply for a smaller thing first, like an undergraduate an undergraduate research and engagement grant. So they might get a team of undergraduates together and say, hey, I just want to do this little project, and you don't have to, you could ask for the full $25,000, or if it's just, hey, I want, $10,000 or $5,000 to work with these students on this project and to find a way to connect to NASA that way through any of those programs we mentioned in the presentation, or if you're looking for another way to get in there. Again, I can talk to you about whatever your idea is and give you some potential ideas of who to contact. So that's another way that sometimes they start out smaller doing that. Traditionally, we have offered, and we may offer again in the future, but right now we're not, collaboration grants, which are usually like small $2,500 grants where new researchers can go, and it's basically a travel grant to a NASA center to go meet folks. That's one option. The other thing that I will tell you, and I'm sorry I skipped over this because there's so much to get into such a small amount of time, is NASA quite often holds technical interchange meetings, and of course proposer telecons to certain things. But at some of their industry days, or NASA, they call them industry days, but certainly university researchers are welcome at those too, where they will have them at the NASA centers so that you can go and find out what sort of things NASA is looking for and meet and greet with those researchers. So like, for instance, last year, NASA Ames had a session like that. And so they will hold those sometimes as well. So it's something else to think about, like a technical interchange meeting is another place where you can just sort of go and test the waters and meet some folks.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And I know.
Oh, sorry. Hi.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, this is Karen. Thank you, Allison. I've been asking Allison a couple of individual questions offline. Thanks for the responses. I have one more question that perhaps others will be interested in too, and that's whether the slides for this presentation will be available. You had some great tips for how to make about both the cost match and how to be real specific in the recruitment of the type of students that are important to try to recruit. So will this presentation be available somewhere maybe on the Space Grant webpage? Or if I email you, could I get copies of those slides in particular about the tips for students recruiting the right kind of students and being specific about how you'll do that?
Yes. So I believe that Allison, we've been recording this as well, haven't we?
Yes. So this meeting has been recorded. The recording, as well as the slides, will be available on our ISGC shared Google Drive folder. So the way that you can access that is by going to our website, idahoSpaceGrant.org, and then there's a resources tab, and then in that drop-down menu, you'll want to select resources for grant applicants, and there will be a link to our shared drive folder, and you'll find these resources there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Rich Stoll sent us a couple of questions. Rich, do you want to ask those, or do you want us to read them off? Although I think you're on mute.
Hello?
Hi, Rich.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
You can go ahead and read them off. It's fine. I think the second question actually got answered in one of the slides, so mostly just the first answer, which I think Allison's responded. Short answer is no.
Yeah, and so Rich's question was, does the ISGC provide an advance on grant funding? As a sub-awardee, the ability to receive reimbursement on some upfront costs would be very helpful versus having to wait perhaps several months for reimbursement. And yeah, generally we can't give you an advance, but quite often certain organizations, and especially at universities, will sometimes, if you ask them, set up an advanced spending account, as long as you have the award letter from us. Because for those of you who haven't had grants from us before, what normally happens is that we receive the proposals, we hold review meetings. Quite often there's a bit of back and forth with questions to the proposers and things like that. And then once the review committees have settled on who is selected, then we send out award letters, which starts the process. And then they have to return a certain amount of paperwork to us. And then basically a contract has to be negotiated between the University of Idaho and whoever that organization is. And sometimes that can be done quickly in a couple of weeks. And sometimes it takes a couple months because people are going back and forth in the contracting office and things like that. So sometimes, if that is the case where things are going back and forth, you can, at your organization, request an advanced spending account from your organization. And we've had those, some organizations say, as long as we have the award letter and know that that money is basically, there, as long as we get the contract settled out, then they could do like a cost transfer later to that budget. That's the only way we can't usually give that funding, because you have to invoice us, to get your grant funds normally. And I think, like you said, as far as travel reimbursement, his other question was about how that's handled. In general, it's handled like just about everything else. Our big message is always save your receipts and submit everything, because with federal funds like ours are, they need receipts for everything. And we highly recommend, if you're traveling, using federal or Idaho state per diem rates, as opposed to, reimbursing, individual meals with, receipts that way. It's just so much easier just to use the per diem rate. Okay. Any other questions?
Well, I know that we are both always happy to answer questions that come in via email as well. And a question that you ask us via email is something that will inform the slides that we offer in the future as well. So you'll be doing the greater community a favor.
Absolutely. We know we've run over time. We appreciate those of you who stuck through to the end. And we look forward to seeing your proposals, or if not, for these opportunities for our Idaho NASA EPSCoR opportunities. And if you think of other questions or you want to see this in action again, we'll have another telecon like this on November 8th.
Thank you. It's very helpful.
Oh, we're glad that it's considered helpful.
Thanks.
All right, at this, we'll let Allison end the meeting unless there's anything else.
All right, bye everyone.
Bye. Thanks.